So we've been looking at the lifestyles of people in England between 1250 and 1500, and one of the things we've seen is that people were potentially quite healthy in terms of their lifestyle. The problem is that they're not. We know that the population of the country drops by more than half between 1300 and 1450, and historians reckon that infant mortality rates, so the number of people who die in childhood, was somewhere between 30 and 50%. So potentially half of everybody didn't live to become an adult. Which indicates that there were a lot of problems with health. So I've boiled these down to 4 main reasons, and reasons why people weren't necessarily all that healthy between 1250 and 1500. And the first one of these is famine. England was a country where everyone relied on the farmers to produce enough food, and when they didn't, it caused problems. Even when people didn't starve to death, a lack of food could lead to further health problems and just further problems in general. So famine is the first thing to look at. Now, the most important example of this is probably what was called the Great Famine. Remember that in this context, great means big. It doesn't mean fantastic. And that began in 1315 with bad weather that destroyed the crops, and then diseases attacked the livestock and the animals on the farms. So ultimately it lasted until 1321 or 1322. And during this time period, it's estimated that it caused a 15% rise in the mortality rate, the rate at which people died. Other estimates suggest that it wiped out 10% of the population. And famine caused ongoing problems. If the crops failed in one year, it didn't lead to just problems in that year, it led to problems further on as well. Because when people were enduring a famine, they didn't have enough to eat. And that meant that they were too weak to work. Remember, medieval peasants had to eat 2 to 3 pounds of bread a day to stay strong enough to do the hard physical labour on the farms. So when they couldn't work, it caused further food shortages. They might kill and eat the animals on their farm, not just the ones that were meant for food, but the ones that were meant for work as well, like horses and oxen. And again, that makes it very difficult to get your farm up and running again once the famine is over. And they might also eat what's called their seed grain, which was the grain that they kept back to plant the fields with the following year. And if they did that, they had nothing to plant, and therefore it was difficult to produce crops again the next year. So all of these things in a famine might lead to further food shortages. And there were a number of famines in this time period, and they caused serious problems. Now, another problem at this time was caused by a lack of hygiene and a lack of understanding of hygiene as well. People didn't know about germs, and they didn't know about the potential of germs to cause health problems. So as an example of this, we've already seen that people in medieval times ate a lot of bread, and rich people would eat wheat bread, and poor people would eat bread that was made out of a grain called rye. The problem was that rye sometimes had mould on it. So there's some mould on this bread. And that mould was called ergo. And when people ate it, it caused a disease called ergotism, which was pretty nasty. It caused painful red pustules, all over the body. It could cause convulsions and fits. It was reputed to send people mad. It was very painful, and ultimately it could cause gangrene, where the flesh rotted, and death. People at the time didn't understand this. It doesn't actually get worked out until the 1670s, when people start to ask questions about why poor people are getting this disease and rich people aren't. But at the time they called it St. Anthony's fire. And their cure for it was to pray to St. Anthony and to hope that he cured you. So that was one problem. Another problem came with the houses. Now, if we look inside this house, for example, one problem was that there wasn't a chimney. There was a hole in the roof. People would hang their meat near the ceiling to smoke it. But it meant that the houses were very smoky, and that led to lung problems and breathing problems, as far as we can gather. Another problem was that people tended to cover the floor with straw or rushes. Now, there's also evidence that people, or some people certainly, swept their houses very often. Archaeologists have found medieval houses where the floors quite hollowed out because they were so well brushed. But the straw and the rushes on the floor provided quite a nice little living environment for various vermin, like rats and mice and lice. Apparently, when Henry IV was crowned, a witness at the time said that you could clearly see the lice crawling over his head. So parasites and other unhygienic sort of aspects might be living in that straw and rushes. Another problem was that medieval people tended to keep their animals indoors, certainly in the colder weather, and partly because animals were the most valuable things they owned and they didn't want them to get stolen. So at night, in colder weather, families would bring the animals indoors with them. And of course that makes hygiene and parasites more of a problem. So that's another problem with hygiene. There were further problems with water. One of the reasons that people drank so much in the way of small ale was because it was safer. They didn't know this, but boiling the water in the brewing killed a lot of the germs. But there were various reasons why the rivers would be polluted. People used them to throw away their waste, they used them for washing in. There were also some problems around industries as well. So, for example, the one that I want to talk about is called fulling, which is a process where you clean and soften wool. And towards the end of this time period, they'd worked out a way to power the hammers that softened the wool with a water wheel. So they would build fulling mills on the rivers. But the problem with this is that the mixture that they used to clean the wool contained large amounts of urine. And when it was finished with, it would seep into the rivers and people's drinking water. So that was another reason why people might find that a lack of hygiene could lead to further disease. There are also problems with poverty. A lot of people were just very, very poor. Historians reckon, again, we're estimating because not very accurate records were kept at the time, but historians reckon that only about 25% of people owned enough land to support themselves. And that 40% of people had to buy some or all of their food. And a lot of peasants were working on little strips of land rented to them by the lords. They just didn't have enough money or enough resources to see them through hard times. Another problem, you remember with the fulling mills, which were there to help the wool trade. The wool trade was increasingly prosperous during this time And towards the end of the time period, some of the lords had started to fence off land to keep the sheep in. This was called enclosure. But the land they fenced off was quite often common land that poor people had used to graze their animals, so that caused them problems as well. They didn't have anywhere to graze their animals anymore. A final reason why there was so much ill health at this time was a lack of medical knowledge. And certainly a lack of understanding about how to help people when they were sick or injured. People worked incredibly hard in medieval times, and they worked with quite a lot of sharp tools. Work was quite dangerous. People might fall out of trees, they might accidentally hurt themselves with an axe or a scythe. People had got into arguments quite often as well because they were working very close together on strips of land, especially at times when they were under pressure, such as the harvest. They got irritable and they might get into fights, and if they did, they had sharp tools to hand. So if people got wounded or injured, there was no way of preventing that from causing further problems, and those things could quite often lead to death as well. Similarly, with wars, which remember were sometimes caused by the kings, battles might kill people, but they might also cause injuries that later caused the death of people. And what's more, wars often disrupted farming as well, because of the fighting and the soldiers that were moving over the land. So they could lead to famine in their own right as well. So there were a lot of reasons why life between 1250 and 1500 in England was quite precarious and quite dangerous, and led to a lot of ill health, a lot of disease, and ultimately a lot of death.